Well, thank you, Abby, Emily, Javier, and Nate. So we've been looking at some questions here and putting them together. I did have a question right off the bat for Nate and maybe everybody. So I thought that the um, kind of wage analysis was really interesting. And I was just curious of how much of the cost of living in the Bay Area plays into that analysis. And another way to ask that would be, do you see any differences in training to job pipeline in other markets, like maybe the Central Valley, compared to the Bay Area?
It's a great question, and I can kind of jump on it first. So MIT has a living wage calculator, which does, basically calculates both a living wage for an individual with no dependents, and then also kind of a range of calculations beyond that for number of dependents and presence of a spouse or not. Emily, thank you so much for sharing that. Um, and I think we talk about it in the memo, but I couldn't find it before trying to answer it. So I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but maybe Emily does because she had the link. Um, but yeah, it's certainly a factor. I think there's, some competition for, and there's the Alameda one, perfect. Um, Both living wage is a factor and then also just comparative wages to overall economy, right? If there are alternatives, folks will kind of look there, and maybe not make decisions based off of like, does this meet the living wage, but is it a wage that works for me? And also relative to opportunities. Emily, you were quick on the draw, so surely you have some numbers.
Yeah, sorry, I'm typing furiously. Um, this was really important for our partnership also to really tune into, sometimes like we might think like, is $20 an hour? Is that a good wage? Is $30 an hour a good wage? And this was one of there are several great tools that Abby mentioned. Our toolkit, job quality and labor standards toolkit is going to come out very shortly. And in the appendices, if you're interested in additional calculators, you can find them there. But the number that I'm just about to type in is that, for example, a worker in Alameda County in a 2-income household with 2 kids needs to earn a minimum of $38.01 per hour in order to meet the baseline living wage standards determined by the MIT Living Wage Calculator. So sometimes we found in our partnership that the needs in the Bay Area, even though we all know that cost of living is quite high in the Bay Area, the needs were actually much higher than people realized per hour.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go back to our questions. This question came in with a little bit of table setting, I think, because it has to do with what types of projects are we talking about here. And the question is, which appliances, equipment, or items form the basis for your study, Nate, due to being subject to the Bachwood NOx rules? So just so everybody is clear on what appliances we're talking about.
Yeah, I think I typed this out. So it's building, heating, and cooking, I believe. But as for like respondents to our survey, that was contractors writ large for anybody who does electrical, plumbing, or heating. I would imagine that they, similarly work on those types of appliances generally, but we didn't ask specifically, do you work on these appliances?
Yeah, kind of a follow-up to that. I think this question came from Ann Edminster. Did the 98 respondents break down commercial or union versus residential non-union?
Yeah, 80%, about 80% were residential in the respondents. Again, that's just survey respondents. That's not necessarily market share. And I was just in the middle of trying to figure out the union split, but I would imagine it kind of falls in the same, along the same lines largely.
Yeah. Um, this one's for Emily and Abby. What is residential prevailing wage? It's different than prevailing wage on commercial projects or public funded projects.
Yeah, I'll put the link in the chat. These prevailing wages are determined by the Department of Industrial Relations in the state of California, and they're just publicly available on the DIR's website. So I'll send you the link to that, and they're by county, but you'll see in the wage schedules that many of those rates are shared amongst multiple Bay Area counties. So I'll put the link to all of them and then just one example of Alameda County so you guys can get a sense of what a prevailing wage rate schedule looks like.
Great. We had an interesting question come in specifically about Pescadero, and I think the question was, how do we get contractors to serve Pescadero? But it is a universal problem. It's not just Pescadero. There are many rural Bay Area locations that have a hard time getting served, especially by multiple contractors. Sometimes they have trouble just finding one. So does anybody want to touch on that, of how we can get more contractors in rural areas, or training, or just general resources out to folks that are serving those areas? This one's for everybody. And if nobody, yeah.
That's a great question. I don't have the response there. I'll definitely look into that. That's certainly an area where I would consider, a priority. I'll toss it to the panelists to see if they have more insight there. But in our particular county in West Marin, and some of the rural areas there, we do focus on targeting these areas for upskilling and bringing training resources to community partners in those areas.
Helen, I apologize. I was doing a horrible job of multitasking and trying to respond to written comments at the same time as listening. Do you mind repeating the question?
Oh yeah, the question was about basically contractors in rural areas. So yeah, we've had, Javier just mentioned West Marin, which is the county I work in. That's a good example that I see a lot, is folks out there in those areas, they have a very limited selection of contractors to choose from, or maybe not any at all that will call them back. And when we talk about getting more contractors involved in decarbonization, electrification work, but also expanding the contractor base, I think especially from a county perspective, we want to make sure that we have coverage in all parts of the county, all residents. Just wondering if you've seen anything in your research that kind of, that would lend support to that.
No data specifically that comes to mind. I will say it does present an interesting challenge where there's an obvious, need, where if there's only a handful of contractors to begin with and they're all very busy, as we, there was another question that we asked in the survey was, what is your workload for the coming months or year? And a lot of people are booked out for months. I forget exactly what the number was, but I think it was like 2 months on average. So if there are a limited number of contractors, and you can't get a call back, or you can't get somebody out for 2 months, that's not a great situation, especially if there's an emergency replacement. The other side of the coin, though, is in a residential market that potentially doesn't have a lot of demand that can sustain a substantially larger number of contractors, you risk having a large number of trained workers who now are fighting for a fewer number of projects. So it is a balancing act of thinking about, maximizing how these projects can get done, but also being aware of, the challenge of potentially overtraining or training folks and then having some geographic challenges.
Yeah, speaking of training, this is one I kind of came up with. Nate, you talked about incentives being important for contractors in your survey work. And did any contractors mention some of the additional support programs like MCE's Green Workforce Pathways, or I know there's a lot of different programs like North Bay Workforce Alliance that provide support to any small business, including contractors, in terms of hiring and training. Did that come up at all as something that is missing or needed more of, besides just financial incentives?
Yeah, I think across the board, there's a need for more awareness of programs. I think contractors run the range of being, some folks were very tapped in and aware of a lot of things that were going on in the region. And other contractors, it was clear they were just, they have their pipeline of work and that's what they're interested in, and they don't feel like they need kind of additional services beyond that. So I think there is, and those are the folks that we were able to contact, which always leaves the question of folks that we didn't speak with, right? Which are potentially even harder to contact or get access to or share information with. So yeah, I think the push for information is definitely necessary, and to the point about distributors being a really important contact point. Contractors of all sorts have to go to distributors generally, and so that being the one contact point that's kind of central across all contractors, I think is definitely something to emphasize.
Javier, did you want to piggyback on that at all? If not, I can move on.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. We got a question for Emily and Abby. How is the partnership working with state agencies to support your work? And a second part to this question is in the residential space, is one of the top reasons why existing residential employers aren't implementing the labor standards because of the cost and the competition. Contractors who aren't following the rules, offering lower costs, etc. If so, do you know to what extent that reason is disincentivizing employers? It's a long one. I can repeat parts of it.
I can see it. Abby, do you want to jump in or? Okay. Working with state agencies is incredibly important to creating the kind of market transformation that our partnership is seeking. Our geographic boundary is the 9-county Bay Area, but in the Bay Area, we're highly influenced by state decision-making. So our partnership, along with other coalitions, was very successful at advocating for labor standards in the CEC's Equitable Building Decarb program, and those labor standards are quite robust. And a great model for other programs. And as those labor standards flow down to the local and regional level, it's much easier for us as a market on a regional level to make that shift and align. We're in regular conversations with CARB, CPUC, with the California Workforce Development Board's High Road Climate Agency Partnerships Group, and the CEC, which are the primary actors that are working on implementing regulations and funding public subsidies to help compliance with those regulations around decarbonization. So our hope is to try to coordinate a statewide interagency partnership to align on the use of these recommended labor standards in all publicly funded programs, Bay Area and statewide. And then on the second question, our partnership did, with the support of our partner CTWI, focus groups, interviews, a second round of interviews with contractors, and we have permanent paid participant seats from contractors within the partnership. So those are the ways that we're conferring with residential employers about the best course of action for their interests. And what we've regularly heard is that, at least from the contractors that we have engaged in these different engagements, that because recruitment and retention is such a pressing problem, that they favor a shared minimum standard. If there isn't a level playing field, then contractors cannot afford to comply with voluntary labor standards, for example. These do need to be required so that all contractors are unburdened from the race to the bottom.
Helen, I just want to say, I think we've got time for one more question.
Okay. Yeah, and just to respond to that, Emily, that echoes the sentiment I've heard from contractors just about enforcing building codes and permits. That creates a, baseline standard that everyone has to work up to keep everybody on the same playing field. Here's kind of a general one. Is there a place where all these training programs are listed and rebate programs are listed? is there a way for everybody to get all the information on what's available to them based on, you know, where they live? Does anyone know of anything?
We have some information in our back pocket, and I know Nate does too, but we're not ready to share it yet. Sneha, I'm going to send you an email about this, but I'm hoping we'll work with you to expand on that list and publish it, if you don't mind. But sorry, you guys, I have to make you guys wait. We're not quite ready yet.